Today we're going to be talking about chapters 3, 4, and 5 of Frankenstein. Now, in chapters 3, 4, and 5, we are seeing Victor as he is a young man. First, we saw his childhood in 1 and 2. Now we're seeing Victor as a young man. So, he is at 17, about to head off to university, when something happens. This is something that is, what he says, the first great misfortune in his life. Now, it's not that his sister, Elizabeth, becomes sick with scarlet fever. Some of you had that on your quiz. She does become sick, and that's part of it. But what the real issue is although Elizabeth becomes sick and recovers from scarlet fever, Victor's mother, who nurses Elizabeth, unfortunately does not recover, and she dies from scarlet fever. So that is the first great misfortune in his life, that his mother dies from scarlet fever. And that also puts a delay in his going to university. But finally, still grieving, a few weeks later, he takes off for the city of Ingolstadt. Now, Ingolstadt is in Germany. Stadt, S-T-A-D-T, actually means city in German. So he is in Geneva, Switzerland. That's where he's from. And he's heading to Ingolstadt, Germany. This is a distance that would take us today a few hours in a plane. Or if we drove in a car, probably take about 8 hours to drive straight through, 7 or 8 hours. But back then, it would have taken them a few days. So he travels to Ingolstadt. Now, when Victor gets to Ingolstadt, unfortunately, the first professor he sees is Monsieur Krempe. And Monsieur Krempe is not exactly the perfect professor for Victor. I'm sure you've all had teachers that were not your favorites. And this is not Victor's favorite. When he goes to him, first of all, he doesn't like the way the guy looks. He just doesn't, it doesn't appeal to him. He thinks this professor's repulsive. And the professor also completely dismisses everything that Victor's done as a total waste of time, everything he's studied, total waste of time, which reminds him of his dad doing the same thing when he was younger without explanation. You know, he didn't take the time to sit Victor down and explain why he said that. And this professor is much the same way. So he gives Victor an instant dislike of the natural philosophy that he was teaching. But fortunately, Victor sits in on the lecture of another professor before he just takes off and leaves because he's so disgusted. He meets with Monsieur Waldman. And Monsieur Waldman is a very different character. He is erect bearing, he is distinguished, and he has the most soothing voice that Victor's ever heard. It's like a song. He likes to listen to the man talk, and when he goes to see him, he's very supportive, Monsieur Waldman is, of Victor. Even though Victor himself admits that his studies probably needed some more work, he's supportive, and he becomes Victor's mentor. And so Victor decides to study the sciences. And as we go into chapter 4, he's really thrown himself into his studies. He is just so enthusiastic and so dedicated to what he's doing that he comes to believe that he has surpassed his professors. After studying for years at the university, he feels that he has, in fact, learned some things that they don't know. He's studying about anatomy. He's studying about the human frame. He's studying life and its counterpart, as he says, death and decay. And as he studies these things, he becomes, and he is telling this tale to Robert Walton, our captain on the ship, but he's telling this tale, and he says, I am the possessor of the secret of how to create life. I understand how to create life. He doesn't tell the professor, he doesn't tell the captain what it is, but he says, I can do it. And not only that, he intends to. He is going to create life. So he's been working all alone, pushing himself, locking himself up, and to this point, he's really kind of neglected writing home or, corresponding with his friends, with his family, with Elizabeth. And so I guess there's nobody there to say to him, what are you thinking? This is kind of strange. are you crazy? Because he decides that he's going to create life. And he makes some very practical considerations. He starts working with organs and body parts because he's determined he's going to make a man. He's going to make a Superman, the perfect man. So he has to have body parts, right? You're going to put a man together, you're going to bring it to life, you've got to have something to start with. He goes into graveyards and slaughterhouses to get the parts for what he needs to do. He has to be secretive about it. He knows this is not something that normal people do, but he is obsessed. It is pushing him to do these things. He has this obsession. So, Victor, having been so shut off from everybody else, doesn't see anything strange about what he's doing when he goes to all these places. Even though there is a part of him that knows that it's wrong, so he goes to these slaughterhouses and things in secret, and he goes at night, and he works in his own apartment, away from everyone else. And as we go into the next chapter, which now we're into chapter 5, we actually see the results of his years of labor, his years of obsession, after studying for years at university and ignoring everything else. He has, laying on the slab in front of him, a creature that he has created. Unfortunately for Victor, this creature does not look like the perfect being. He has yellow eyes and gray skin, and when Victor looks at him, he doesn't see a perfect man. He sees a strange creature who, upon being awakened to life, as Victor said he had the power to do, reaches out for Victor. And Victor is horrified. He's horrified. He's not proud of what he's done. He's not like triumphant. He has created life, but it's not perfect. He's not a perfect man. He doesn't look great. He doesn't look fantastic. He's kind of grotesque. And Victor is repelled by this. And he shuts the room and he goes into his own room, and he's so exhausted that finally, now he's done everything, he falls into a sleep. But the sleep is not very restful. He has nightmares. He dreams about Elizabeth. First time he's thought in Elizabeth for a while. As many of you said on your test, he does seem to take Elizabeth for granted. But he dreams of Elizabeth, his so-called beloved, his more than sister, and he sees her dying. He sees his mother's corpse. Very disturbing nightmare dreams. And when he wakes up, the monster, the creature, is looming down over him and perhaps smiling at him. But it probably looks like a grimace from the way the monster looks. So Victor now just loses it completely and runs out of the house and leaves the creature there. He just takes off. He can't handle it. He's so freaked out by what he's done. He leaves and wanders the streets at night and paces back and forth in the courtyard in front of his house, and then he goes into the town. And in the morning, he goes to the inn because he hasn't had anything to eat or anything. And he sees, at the inn of all people, Henry Clerval, his childhood friend. He had not seen Henry since he was a kid. He's like, "What are you doing here?" And Henry says, "I've come to study at the university. My father's going to let me study at the university just like you did." And Victor is very happy and excited to see Henry Clerval, his childhood friend. You know, this reminds him of home and all the good things that used to be his life. But Henry Clerval, seeing Victor, sees something quite different. Victor does not look like his old self. He is ill looking. He is very pale. He's been working inside for years. He is thin. He probably doesn't eat what he should eat. He hasn't been sleeping well. He looks terrible. Victor invites Henry back to his apartment, knowing that the creature's there, but he invites him back to his apartment, and he is filled with dread at the thought of what's going to happen when he gets to that apartment and that creature's there. I mean, how are you going to explain that? "Oh, this is just the creature that I brought to life. How you do?" You know, I mean, you can't really just introduce Henry to this person. But they get back to the room. Victor opens the door to the house. They go inside, and the creature's not there. And Victor's ecstatic. He literally claps his hands. He's so happy. And Henry Clerval is like, "What is going on?" Victor is just so excited and relieved. He basically has in his head, oh, that's all done with now. Good, don't have to think about that anymore. Whew, that was a mistake. Now it's done. And he just totally is so overtaken with everything that's happened. The shock of everything, the extent of his labors and having worked over this creature, that Victor falls down on his bed and he's ill. And he basically has a fever and is feverish for months. And Henry Clavell, this great guy who was his childhood friend, nurses Victor back to health. There's some comparisons there, but anyway, he nurses Victor back to health. And Victor finally starts thinking more about home and his friends and all of that, because Henry Clavell gives him a letter from home, from Elizabeth, the person he's neglected so badly. Now, after we read chapter 1 and 2, I asked you all to think a little bit about personal responsibility. And I want you to continue thinking about that as we read the rest of the book. And as things happen in the book, I want you to ask yourself, is this something that Victor is partially responsible for? Or does he have no responsibility? And you'll see what I'm talking about as we read on and you see what happens in the book. But we are going to talk about that personal responsibility. That's one of the themes in the book. Another thing that I'd like you to think about is Victor's idea of creating this perfect being and the kind of thinking that he has. He has this decision, I'm going to do this, and it's going to be great, and everybody's going to hail me as this fantastic scientist because I know how to create life. But he doesn't think beyond the point of creating life and waking it up. He doesn't think, what's it going to be like? What if this creature isn't perfect? What if he doesn't do it right? What if it is perfect and he's created this new man out of all these different pieces? Well, what is that man going to be like? He doesn't think about that. And so much does he not think about the causes and the effects. He doesn't think about the effects of what he's done, that when the creature awakens, to him, that's like the end of an experiment. It was successful. It wasn't 100% successful because he wasn't perfect, but he did bring him life. And to Victor, it's like that's the end of the experiment as far as he was concerned. He doesn't think about what happens down the line. So that's something that we should be looking at too, is the causes and effects here of why things happen. So this experiment, as far as Victor's concerned, is successful in the sense that he brought life, and he kind of just loses his obsession the minute that the creature comes to life. And now, as far as he's concerned, it's done, and we'll go on and see how that approach works out for Victor as we continue the reading of the rest of Frankenstein. Thank you.